Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into the Finnish national security scene.
Specifically, the Finnish Security and Intelligence Service, Supo, as it's known.
Exactly. We've gathered quite a bit of public information tracing its history, its evolution, and what it does today.
Right, so the idea is to really unpack this key Finnish agency.
Consider this your fast track to understanding Supo, its, well, quite interesting origins, how it navigated the Cold War,
Which was incredibly tricky for Finland.
and its role right now. So let's get into it.
Okay, so where do we start? The beginning seems logical. Why Supo even came to be is pretty revealing.
It wasn't just shuffling deck chairs, was it?
Not at all. It was officially founded December 17th, 1948, got operational early 49.
And the legal basis was put in place quickly, the Acton Decree.
Yes, ratified promptly. But the reason for its creation was a direct response to major issues with the agency it replaced the state police, Valpo.
And the sources we looked at are pretty blunt about Valpo's problems.
They are. It wasn't just underperforming. There were serious integrity concerns.
Like its leadership, filled with communists, apparently.
Yes, and implicated in illegal activities, even disappearances after World War II. It was messy.
So messy that a government committee basically said, this needs to go, back in October 48.
And Parliament agreed. So Supo's initial mission, right from the get-go, was shaped by needing to be fundamentally different, more reliable than Valpo.
Makes sense. And you can't really understand Supo without understanding Finland's position during the Cold War.
Absolutely critical context. Finland's location, its neutrality. It was unique, right between East and West.
A major playground for spies, I imagine.
Oh, definitely. Intense intelligence activity from both sides. Finland was a buffer zone, a transit route. Even airspace got used.
So for Supo in those early days, what were the priorities, given that pressure cooker environment?
Well, the information points to two main things. Monitoring domestic communist groups,
Right.
the Finnish Communist Party, these so-called home Russians, and crucially, preventing illegal intelligence gathering, especially Soviet espionage. KGB, GRU. That was job number one.
How would they even go about that? Surveillance? Informants?
It likely involved a mix. Cultivating sources, tracking activities, trying to identify agents, but the real
Or at
challenge...
least doing it without causing a diplomatic incident.
Precisely. Especially with the Soviet Union next door. They had to be effective, but also incredibly careful.
Which brings us to Finlandization. Can you unpack that term a bit for listeners who might not be familiar? It sounds, well, uniquely Finnish.
It really is. Finlandization was Finland's, let's call it a survival strategy during the Cold War.
Okay.
It meant maintaining independence, keeping its democratic systems, but also being very careful not to antagonize the Soviet Union, accommodating Moscow's foreign policy interests to avoid, intervention.
So a constant balancing act.
A very delicate one. And for Supo, this meant counterintelligence had to be super cautious. Effective, yes, but quiet. No big public scandals involving the Soviets.
That makes their covert links with the CIA, which the sources mention, even more fascinating. How did that work alongside trying not to provoke Moscow?
It suggests a very pragmatic, behind-the-scenes approach. A mutual interest, presumably, in understanding and countering Soviet moves.
But not something they had advertised.
Absolutely not. The sources say there was reluctance to even document it. Exposure could have shattered Finland's neutral stance. It was likely ad hoc, clandestine intelligence sharing, maybe tips on suspected agents.
Things seem to shift when Urho Kekkonen becomes president in '56. Supo starts morphing into more of a presidential police. What does that mean?
It means its focus wasn't just external threats anymore. It increasingly involved gathering intel to directly support President Kekkonen's policies, both domestic and, critically, foreign policy.
Especially managing that all-important relationship with Moscow.
Exactly. Kekkonen needed to be deeply informed. About Finnish communists, yes, but also about what Western agencies like MI6, apparently, were picking up. It was about navigating those treacherous waters.
So, providing intelligence for statecraft, essentially. The sources mention the Night Frost crisis, the Note crisis. Suppose intel would have been vital then.
You'd assume so. Understanding internal political dynamics, anything that Moscow might see as a provocation, that intel would help Kekkonen manage the situation, keep things stable. Supo became a key tool for him.
And Kekkonen solidified this by appointing allies as Supo directors. Arvo Pentti in '72, Seppo Tiedinen in '78.
Right. It suggests he wanted leaders who understood and supported his strategic goals, his way of handling the Soviets, people he trusted to provide the right kind of information and operate discreetly.
Which raises questions about potential politicization, I suppose.
It always does when intelligence agencies become closely tied to the head of state's immediate political needs.
And Kekkonen himself had those famous back channels with the KGB, didn't he? Using them for things like negotiating Finland's IFTA membership. Where did Supo fit into that?
That's less clear from the public sources. It's plausible Supo knew about these channels, maybe even helped facilitate or secure them under Kekkonen's direction. It shows how blurred the lines could get between formal intelligence and informal diplomacy.
So this complex dance, public neutrality, private channels, and Supo adapting. This fits with the shift in their counterintelligence tactics, right? Moving towards quieter methods.
Yes. Instead of noisy expulsions of suspected KGB agents, they'd often opt for discreet removal, asking people to leave quietly.
Why the change?
To avoid damaging those carefully managed relations with Moscow, public scandals were risky. A quiet, preventive approach served the same counterintelligence purpose without the diplomatic fallout. It was subtle, maybe more effective in that context.
Then comes a really big event, the defection of KGB Major Anatoly Golitsyn in Helsinki in 1961.
Golitsyn. Yes, a major defection.
And he made some explosive claims to the CIA about massive Soviet influence in Finland, even suggesting Kekkonen himself was compromised.
He did. Those claims sent ripples through Western intelligence. They were treated with a mix of, let's say, intense interest and caution.
Were they believed?
Okay.
Especially about Kekkonen.
The specifics about Kekkonen were hard to verify, very controversial. But Golitsyn's broader information on Soviet methods was often valuable.
And the impact on Supo's Western contacts.
It actually seemed to increase cooperation, paradoxically.
Yeah.
Western agencies became more willing to share intel with Supo, like lists of suspected KGB officers to watch. It highlighted the shared threat, even amidst the skepticism about some claims.
Okay, let's shift gears. Post-Cold War, something really struck me. Supo didn't get powers of arrest or pretrial investigation until January 1st, 1989. That seems late.
It does seem late, doesn't it? But it reflects that deep caution we talked about. Remembering Valpo's history, there was a real reluctance to give Supo powers that could be misused, perceived as tools of oppression.
So keeping intelligence gathering separate from law enforcement?
Exactly. The National Bureau of Investigation handled the criminal side. It was about checks and balances, protecting civil liberties, and maybe avoiding any foreign suspicion about Supo's role.
Then in 1990, the Titanen list arrives from West Germany. Supposedly names of Finns linked to the East German Stasi.
Right, a potentially explosive piece of intelligence just as the Cold War was ending.
But Director Titanen and President Koivisto decided it wasn't reliable, based on vague hints, not hard evidence.
Apparently so. It really shows the challenge of vetting intelligence, especially from foreign sources during times of upheaval. Information can be flawed, incomplete, even deliberately misleading. Classifying it showed its sensitivity but also the lack of solid proof.
Which unfortunately leads into the Alpo Russi case a decade later. Supozer investigates the diplomat Russi for Stasi ties.
The investigation leaks.
And even though he's eventually acquitted in 2007, his reputation is damaged. He even got compensation.
A really difficult case. It's a stark reminder, isn't it? The potential human cost when intelligence investigations go public, even if the suspicions aren't ultimately proven. It highlights the need for immense care, solid evidence, and due process.
The sources also mentioned Finland looking to criminalize espionage against exiles living there around 2012. Sweden had already done this.
Yeah, that suggests a growing awareness of a specific threat foreign powers potentially targeting dissidents or refugees on Finnish soil. It shows how laws need to adapt as threat perceptions change, sometimes learning from neighbors.
More recently, 2016, Supo moves administratively, directly under the Interior Ministry, no longer under the National Police Board. Why?
The stated goal was efficiency, better strategic direction, maybe clearer lines of command both domestically and internationally. Streamlining things.
And around the same time, late 2016, Supo raises alarms about foreigners buying land or property near sensitive sites. Potential hybrid operations, what does that mean?
Good question. Hybrid operations here likely means activities that aren't conventional warfare but serve strategic goals. Buying land near a military base or broadcast tower.
Not for an obvious attack, but maybe?
Maybe for subtle surveillance, housing unmarked personnel, logistics, exerting influence. Things that blur the lines, are deniable, and happen below the threshold of open conflict.
Which led to new laws in 2017 to monitor and potentially block these kinds of strategic property purchases by non-EU entities.
Shows how security threats evolve, right? It's not just spies and terrorists in the traditional sense.
And speaking of terrorism, the Turku stabbing in August 2017 was a grim milestone. Investigated by Supo, considered Finland's first suspected terror attack since World War II.
A tragic event and a clear sign of the changing threat landscape Supo now has to deal with.
So, bringing us up to today, what are Supo's main jobs now?
The core functions are still counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and counterproliferation, stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Basically protecting Finland's government system, democracy, and security, both internal and external.
And they're the lead agency for counterterrorism cooperation, threat assessments, monitoring extremism.
That's right. They coordinate nationally and internationally on that front. And the Police Act gives them legal powers for surveillance, undercover work, things like that, within the law, of course.
It's interesting how they're structured, part of the national police, but under the Interior Ministry. A Nordic model, apparently.
Yes, keeping intelligence somewhat linked to the police structure is common in the region.
And that name change in English back in 2010, Finnish Security and Intelligence Service, really leans into the intelligence part.
It emphasizes that aspect more than just security police.
We have some numbers, too. Around 440 staff in 2019, a good mix of police officers and civilians, quite a few women, too, about 40%. Budget in 2023 was nearly 54 million euros.
Headquartered in Helsinki, but with 8 regional offices across the country. Turku, Tampere, Oulu, covering the ground.
Plus liaison officers abroad, Kenya, Turkey, the EU's intelligence hub, shows their international engagement.
And that 2017 reorganization created 7 departments: collection, counterintelligence, terrorism, extremism, regions, vetting, analysis, internal services, a structure designed to tackle today's complex threats.
Finally, let's touch on how Supo's history has been written and viewed. There's an official history, Radakatu 12, commissioned by Supo itself.
Written by professional historians, which lends it credibility.
But not without criticism. Alpo Rusi, for one, and a journalist, felt it omitted things. Others, like politician Erkki Tuomioja, praised its quality.
That's common with official history, isn't it? Balancing access and independence. Professor Kimmo Rentola, a key author who also worked for Supo as a historian, himself noted the challenges.
Challenges like?
Like the source material for intelligence agencies often being ambiguous, limited, sensitive. You might not get the full picture. It's hard to write definitive histories.
And we should remember Supo wasn't the first. There was the Detective Central Police, EK, back from 1919 to 38, mainly focused on anti-communism then.
Right, so there's a longer lineage of security policing in Finland.
Okay, so wrapping this up, Supo's journey seems incredibly tied to Finland's own path, surviving the Cold War, finding its place, adapting to new threats, from replacing Valpo, navigating Finlandization, to tackling modern terrorism and hybrid threats.
It's a fascinating reflection of Finland's unique geopolitical reality, a constant process of adaptation.
Which leaves us with something for you, the listener, to think about.
Considering Finland's experience, this long, complex history of managing tricky international relations and evolving its security agency, what lessons might other countries draw from it? Especially now in our own interconnected, often contested world.
Something to ponder. It's certainly a compelling case study in resilience and adaptation.